My name is Seth, and I'm here very honored and privileged to be having a conversation with Dr. Ed Dodge. Dr. Dodge, I understand that, in our previous conversation, you have a very, very long history of working in healthcare in less than ideal situations. You are also from Angola. You hail actually originally from Angola. Is that right? You were born there?
I was born in the States, but my parents took me to Angola when I was 3 months old. And I lived there. There was one break, but I lived there until I was 14. So my childhood and early adolescence was in Angola. And so, I have Africa in my in my heart.
Okay, great. And at what point did you decide to return to Africa?
After I came back to the States, got my finished high school, got my master's degree, and then went to medical school at Indiana University. And then I got my master of public health at Johns Hopkins University. Mm-hmm. And while I was at Hopkins, Dr. Bissell, who was the dean of the the College of Public Health in Ethiopia, came by to recruit faculty from the students who were graduating from the Hopkins, from the MPH students. And actually about three of us went to Ethiopia under that arrangement. I was married by then and had three small children. Mm-hmm. And my wife was a little hesitant about going with three small children. And in fact, she suffered some pretty severe culture shock. So that had an impact. But overall, the experience was it was a great learning experience, and I enjoyed it very much.
And my
kids liked Ethiopia too.
Oh, okay. and this was in the 1960s, right? 1967.
1967 to 1969.
Okay, great.
3 years. And I was at the Public Health College, which was the college of the Haile Selassie I University. And it was co-sponsored by the World Health Organization as a way to address health manpower shortage in Ethiopia. At that time, Ethiopia only had about 22 physicians for 22 million people. Tremendous shortage.
Wow.
So we trained health officers who were trained both in clinical health and in public health. They were not medical doctors; they were health officers, mm-hmm. And we trained community nurses and sanitarians. They were there to form a team to go out to health outposts all around the country, and so that experiment lasted for about 20 years. I was there for the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the college. And we had an international faculty. We had Ethiopian faculty. We had Belgian, British, and American. And so it was an international faculty. And it was a close-knit faculty because, the way it is that when you're in a foreign land. Mm-hmm. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot there. I learned more than I taught.
Great. So, there's that saying, right? No matter how much education we get, we're always still learning and we're always a student.
That's exactly right. It's good to keep your mind open to that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree with you completely. And so when you came back to Africa and you landed in Ethiopia to support the medical system there, you mentioned offline that at the time, Ethiopia was very resource constrained. You also just mentioned in this interview that there were something like 22 doctors for every how many people?
22 doctors for 22 million. So it's one doctor per million.
One doctor per million at the time. Wow, that's crazy. Hard to imagine. As a Westerner, hard to imagine. And my question for you, though, is when you came back to Africa and were working in Ethiopia in these conditions, this resource-constrained environment, what can you tell the audience? What would you say would be the number one thing that you noticed was lacking? So when you first landed in Ethiopia, if you were to give a specific recommendation to the healthcare system there or to the government, and saying, okay, I know you guys are resource deprived. I know there's only 22 doctors for 22 million people. What is the first thing that you needed to address when you landed in Ethiopia to start turning this around?
I'll tell you, I was not when I landed, but it was after I worked in the rural areas for, well, not very long, a few weeks. I realized the number one problem was access to good, clean water. That was the number one problem. In the villages were scattered all around Ethiopia with very little communication between villages. The roads at that time were the infrastructure was very sketchy, and so villagers lived in mud and stick houses, or in tukels. They called tukels, were round cottages, and the housewife would walk a mile or 2 miles or 5 miles to the nearest source of water. Sometimes it was a spring, sometimes it was a river, and carry it back home with a pot on her head or on her back that held a few gallons. And that had to do with the water supply for the household for that day. And every day she made that trek. And so they used the water very, very carefully. It had to serve for cooking, for drinking, for any washing they did. And they were very, very careful with it.
And you mentioned, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Please continue.
And it was because of the problems with water access that some of the tropical diseases were prevalent. Tick-borne diseases and louse-borne diseases were were common then, and of course, malaria is always a problem in tropical areas. So we dealt with all of that, and the Ethiopian men wore blankets called shamas in the cold season. Ethiopia is an interesting land geographically. It's in the Horn of Africa, and the periphery of the country is all lowland, but the central part is a high plateau, about 7,000 feet, and 7,000 to 10,000 feet. And that's where most of the population lives, in the scattered villages. And the climate, even though it's not too far from the equator, it's 3 degrees north of the equator, the climate was ideal in many ways. I mean, it was because of the altitude. The temperatures in the daytime would be in the 70s and 80s, and the nighttime it'd be in the 50s. And then in the cooler season, which was in January and February, it would get down to frost level sometimes, but most of the time, the daytimes were just very nice. So geographically, that was an ideal place to live. The countryside was mostly agrarian. The farmers grew teff, which is a wheat-like substance, and they ground the teff into a flour, and they made it into injera, which was the sort of the bread-like food that they ate as their staple. Then, so the fields of teff during the growing season were very, they were green, and then they turned for at harvest time, and they harvested as you would think that you were in biblical times. They harvested the way they did in biblical times, with oxen threshing the grain on the threshing floor, and then tossing it up with a pitchfork so the wind would blow the chaff away, and they would gather the grain. And then they would collect the grain and pound it into a flour that they used to make their injera. I learned a tremendous amount there.
So primitive techniques, but yet effective in the modern day, right?
Yeah.
So
today, I think that there's very little of that. That was 1967, and that was over 50 years ago. Today, I haven't been back to Ethiopia to see the farming. I have visited back there one time in 2018, but didn't really get into the farming. But I think they use much more modern implements today.
Okay, great. And you mentioned that one of the first things that you had to help address in Ethiopia was the issue of clean water, and you mentioned that the woman of the family would hand carry or manually carry the family's water supply for the day herself. You mentioned there were two main sources at the time to be accessed for water: rivers and springs. Now, rivers and springs, okay, free flowing. I'm assuming fresh water. And now these freshwater sources of water, I would imagine that was there an issue with parasites and you mentioned malaria, but about bacteria and how clean was the typical water supply that they're accessing, and what kind of sterilization had to be done?
The typical water supply would not be from the river would not be clean. There were mountain streams, so some of the mountain streams were not bad, but the river would not be a real clean source of water. If they had a flowing spring, it would be cleaner, but it would be it still could get contaminated very easily. And they carried it, and it was not manually. They had big gourds. Clay pots that they carried on their head or carried on their backs. And I suppose those would hold maybe 15, 20 gallons, the largest ones. Maybe not that much. No, not that much. More like 5, 10 gallons. Anyway, yes, we had a lot of parasitic diseases. We had hookworm and tapeworm and all kinds of parasitic diseases. And that was for a different reason. That was because there were no good sanitary facilities. People defecated on the roadside, and many of them were barefoot in the real rural areas, or they wore sandals. So we had clinics, and we saw people with hookworm that were anemic because the hookworm drained so much of their blood from their system. Hookworms, and many with tapeworms too. And then rickettsial. There were diseases called rickettsial diseases that were a problem. So that was the reason that the health centers were set up with health officers, with sanitarians who were trained to drill wells. And that was one of the things we did. I carried out educational campaigns in the villages to persuade the villagers to go get together and drill a community well. Or else to put if they had a good spring, to protect the spring with a cement protective construction. And the sanitarians did a good job with that. And some of the villages that were near the roadsides had fairly good supplies of water after the sanitarians did their work. And then the community nurses were very important. A big problem with children was malnutrition. Mm-hmm. The children were breastfed up until they were about 18 months old. And for the first 6 months, they did fine. But after about 6 months, they didn't have any alternative intermediate kind of feeding system. They continued, and the breast milk would be declining. Mm-hmm. And so malnutrition, by the time they were 8 or 9 months old, became a severe problem. And we saw a lot of malnutrition. In fact, I did my research paper on the study of malnutrition, the factors contributing to malnutrition, infant malnutrition under the age of 5. Under the age of 2, actually, mm-hmm. In a village, in a roadside village. And that was very, I learned from that piece of research something too. I thought that the impact of our health centers would be contributing to better health of the infants, but that turned out not to be the strongest factor. The strongest factor turned out to be the economic status of the family. all families were poor. I mean, $100 a month would have been a very rich family in any village there. But most of them would earn less than $1 or two a month. So it was very, very poor, very poor population in the very rural areas. But the thing was that after children, they around age 2 or 18 months, they would be introduced to their adult food, which was injera and wat. Injera is a pancake-like bread that they make, and the wat is the sauce. And sauce, they can make a spicy sauce or one that's not spicy. And they said they like the spicy sauces the best. And the kids would learn to eat that, but they had to make an adjustment. And then they loved it when they learned to eat it. And that was the staple food. That was what Ethiopian families ate morning and night. And if they ate at noon at all, that would have a little injera and wat also.
Would that type of diet, though, be a problem because of the potentially low protein content?
Actually, not bad at all. Teff is probably one of the better protein grains, richest in protein, better than wheat, better than many other grains. So the protein, it was called protein calorie malnutrition, but it turned out that the protein was not the biggest factor. The biggest factor was that there was not a good transition food between breastfeeding and the adult diet. In that era, that time of life was a very hazardous time for the kids. Then they would get measles or infectious diseases or colds or diarrheas, and that combined with the malnutrition, that there was a high mortality rate. Fewer than half of the children, around half the children, would die before the age of 5.
Oh, so, that's absolutely terrible. Yeah, that's a terrible situation. Now, on that note, though, I wanted to make a transition and start talking about a modern crisis that's going on today. It's very topical. It's in every part of the news cycle, and that is the topic of Ukraine. And the reason why I think some of your knowledge and expertise could be very relevant to what's going on in Ukraine today is because of this. Ukraine is also facing a humanitarian crisis. They're also facing a significant breakdown in their medical capacity and their medical capabilities, naturally because of the unstable situation, because of the war, and because of the destruction of major infrastructure. And also, several cities have already been cut off from public utilities. So there's also a question now of having access to food and clean water, and also even basic medical supplies for the injured in Ukraine. And with that being the situation today, let's go back to the topic of clean water. There are areas of Ukraine now where they're having a problem with clean water because of the breakdown in infrastructure. And Dr. Dodge, when you were over there in Ethiopia handling some of the same issues, lack of resource and such, and lack of clean access to water, what were some of the things, besides drilling wells, what would be some of the things that you would recommend to easily get access to clean water, or to purify the water you already have? What are some of the techniques and strategies that you saw being deployed in Ethiopia that could possibly be used by the civilians over in Ukraine to purify their existing water, or to try to gain access to clean water? And of course, besides drilling a well, because I don't think a lot of them have the capacity to do that. So what are some of your thoughts and ideas on that?
Well, boiling water that you're pretty sure it's not safe water. Boiling is probably the best way to purify it. Supposed to boil it for 5 minutes and let it cool. If you get the water to boil, that's the best way to address it. In Ethiopia, in the 60s, one of the ways that most households dealt with it was to make tala. Tala was a slightly alcoholic drink, like a very a weak beer, and that I came to realize that tala was one way that they had to make the water safer for them. They could drink tala instead of water.
Wow.
And it was that generated its own problems, because if you became a tala addict, then you got the alcohol problems. But it was a low alcohol.
Wouldn't that also though potentially give people problems with dehydration, or no?
No, it was such a weak. I don't know what the strength was, but less than 1% alcohol probably.
Oh, okay.
Mostly water.
So somebody could be drinking this all day and not have an issue.
Yeah.
So fermentation was one way for them to try to get clean fluids in their diet. Fermentation,
boiling, and those were the principal methods there. If you had access to chemicals like chlorine, you could chlorinate the water, but they wouldn't have access to that. It would be, and chlorine has its own set of problems.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. And also I wanted to ask you about this, because I know that with a lot of the humanitarian aid that's making its way to Ukraine, the aid that does manage to get to these cities, because again, I want to remind the audience at this time, there are some parts of Ukraine that are completely cut off from major access to roadways and highways because of the military activity going on around the highways. And a lot of the humanitarian aid, like the first aid kits, a lot of the medical supply crates, they have iodine in them. Now, can you kind of give the layman's explanation of how the iodine can work to purify the water? What kind of mechanisms are we talking about? What kind of problems could come with drinking water full of iodine? Tell us a little bit about your experience with that as well.
Well, iodine is in the same family as chlorine. They both work in a similar way. And they're both poisons.
Yeah.
Just think about it.
Right.
So you have to use a very, just a drop or two in a gallon of water, or 5 gallons of water. So the idea is to get enough in there to kill the bacteria, but not enough to kill people.
I read somewhere that like the difference between medicine and poison is a matter of dosage.
That is true for a lot of things. Absolutely. Dosage is critical.
Right. In Ethiopia, did you see a lot of people using iodine, or was this not so popular?
No. Didn't see any of that, actually.
Probably because they already had their...
In the cities, the cities did have municipal water supplies, the larger cities.
Right.
Addis Ababa, the capital, the provincial capitals. Like we lived in Gondar, which was the provincial capital for Begemner province. And that had about 30,000 people. And we had a municipal water supply. And it was, they treated it. They treated the water, I believe it was with chlorine. And so it was safe water, relatively safe. But the problem was they even for the municipalities, the water supplies were usually not adequate. We would have water cut off for a day or two at a time. And what we learned to do was to stockpile water in our bathtub, in our pots and pans. And so you had to, you had to be ingenious in conserving water. And I understand that makes it a huge problem in war zones, like what's happening in Ukraine today. And
right, yeah, you're right. And segueing from the issue and topic of water, let's talk about solid food and nourishment, because I'm already seeing some more parallels between your experiences supporting the healthcare system in Ethiopia, which was resource constrained in your areas, and also in Ukraine, who is also facing a resource shortage. Now, beyond the issue of having access to safe water in some parts of Ukraine, there's also a problem in getting food, but also not only just food, having fresh food and food that has the appropriate nutritional content in it in order to stave off malnutrition, especially with the younger people that are stuck over there in Ukraine. And you mentioned that in Ethiopia, you were talking about there was an issue of malnutrition, but of course the causes, and the background of that malnutrition would be different than Ukraine. So I kind of want to ask you. So in Ukraine, we're having, of course, there's a lot of dry goods, a lot of dry foods being donated and shipped in from outside of Ukraine and being distributed within the country. So there are a lot of people that having access, for example, to dry pasta that can be boiled, of course, rice, things like that. A lot of starches and carbohydrates. Naturally, in some parts of the country, there's no more access to perishable foods like fresh meat, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, and things like that. And historically, when there's an absence of fresh fruits, for example, especially citrus, scurvy, can set in, and other ailments of the kind that are associated with malnutrition. So my question here comes where wanted you to talk a little bit about what are some of the non-perishable foods, right, that you would recommend that people be shipping to Ukraine, donating. What about foods that are high in calories but are also non-perishable? Can you talk a little bit about that? Talk about what kind of foods that are non-perishable would you recommend in a resource-constrained environment? And secondly, give us a conversation about high-calorie dense foods versus low-calorie dense foods, high protein versus the low-protein starchy foods. Go ahead and give us your overview on that.
Well, with the Ukrainian situation, I think probably sending dried foods, freeze-dried foods, is probably the most practical thing. So that's in a nutshell. In Ethiopia, that wasn't an answer then. Mm-hmm. I'd like to contrast Ethiopia in 1962 with my work in Zimbabwe in 2010 to 2015. Okay. There was a dramatic shift in public health problems between 1967 and 2010 to 2015. In 1967-69, the tropical diseases were our main public health problems, and for the children, the diarrheal diseases and the contagious diseases, infectious diseases. By the way, let me mention that once children survived past the age of 5 and got into adolescence and adulthood, they were tended to be pretty healthy, except for they still had exposure to malaria and to other tropical diseases. But if they had adequate TEF and endurance and water, and they had they grew greens, vegetable greens. That's one of their sources of the sauce. The adults in the rural areas were pretty healthy people in general, except for their occasional infection diseases. Mm-hmm. We never saw things like diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and so forth. Contrast that in 2010 to 2015 in Zimbabwe, a tidal wave of fast food industry, it's called globalization, has swept across Africa. Mm-hmm. And so all the towns, even the smaller villages, would have every place would have Coca-Cola everywhere, and you'd have things like burger, not Burger King, but burger joints. Not McDonald's. Well, there were some McDonald's, but some similar burger things, and some fast chicken things like
KFC.
KFC. They were copies of KFC. Anyway, that swept across Africa. And that combined with urbanization, 70% of the populations in Africa are moving into the cities. And so they're getting away from their rural roots. And in urbanization, they have much less physical activity, and they eat these Western foods. And they are now, the big diseases in Zimbabwe today are the Western diseases: hypertension, diabetes, heart disease. They are the huge problems in Zimbabwe today. We never saw those 50 years ago. So what you eat, the staples that you eat, makes a huge difference. You mentioned the high calorie foods versus the lower calorie foods. The high calorie foods that are highly processed foods are just basically not healthy foods. And they're most of what much of the food that Westerners live on today are these ultra processed foods. On the other hand, the healthiest foods are the vegetables and the fruits and the grains that are relatively low in calories, but they're rich in nutritional value. And so I live on a near vegetarian diet with a lot of I get at least 15 servings of vegetables and fruit in a day, and I get 6 servings of grains like oatmeal. Oats are a good rich grain, and we eat Ezekiel bread, which is made of sprouts, wheat, the grain sprouts, not the flour itself. And so that's a relatively low calorie diet. I eat a heaping plate of food every night, and I have a heaping breakfast every morning and a light lunch. And I eat a ton of food, but I don't gain any weight because it's all low calorie food but high in nutrition. And that is the ideal kind of food to live on.
Right.
Paradoxically, that in Zimbabwe and in many parts of rural Africa, that was kind of the types of foods that the grandparents of today's generation lived on. And they were, as I say, generally healthy if they could avoid the tropical diseases. But today, they become addicted to the fast foods, and with a lot less activity, it makes them very vulnerable to the Western diseases.
Right. I can imagine that. And you also, to contrast about what you're discussing earlier with the old Ethiopian diet, you had basically a bunch of people in the rural areas surviving off of grain pancakes with spicy sauce and homemade beer from the village, right? And you mentioned that this category of people are quite healthy and not prone to all of the modern diseases that you saw popping up in modern Zimbabwe, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Incredible. So it's really not a matter of low versus high calorie, right? It's a matter of what then?
Well, it's
fresh versus processed, or
it's
Whole Foods versus
one. I'm blocking on his name, but he's a fairly well-known author. He writes, "Eat food, real food, and don't but not too much." And so, real food versus the ultra-processed foods, which he does not consider as being real food. It's fake food, so to speak. I mean, it comes from original foods, but it's so processed that it's lost a lot of its nutrients. One of the things that we've learned today is that fiber is such an important part of the diet, and we did not know that 50 years ago. Dr. Burkitt he was a British surgeon in Africa, and he made the observation that the high fiber diets of the Africans seem to protect them from many of our modern diseases. And now, for many years, we thought the fiber was, it was there, but we didn't know what purpose it is. But today, we know that the fiber is extremely important. That the gut bacteria thrive on fiber, the healthy gut bacteria. And if they don't get enough fiber, we get bacterial colonies in our guts that are disease prone. Can lead us into disease. You could divide them into good bacteria and bad bacteria. It's oversimplification. But a high fiber diet, which is relatively low in calories, it favors the good bacteria, and that does so much for the immune system, boosting the immune system, boosting health in general, much more than we knew 50 years ago.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. And I know in general in the West, we have a very low fiber contrast. How do I say it? We have a diet that is quite contrarian, right, to what you were discussing. It is a fatty, low fiber diet.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, high in processed sugars also.
This book, I don't know if you can see it.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Fiber Fueled.
Fiber Fueled.
By Dr. Will Wolcevich. He says, call him Will, Dr. Will. Mm-hmm. He's a top gastrointestinal specialist, MD. And just this book is the result of his practice for some 20 years. And what he writes in this book about the value of fiber foods is just tremendous. I recommend this book very highly.
Okay.
Fiber Fueled.
We'll be sure to make sure our audience check it out. And Fiber Fueled. All right. Now, Dr. Dodd, just one more question about this within this discussion about proper, best practices in a resource-constrained medical environment. You talked about Ethiopia, your time in Ethiopia. We also went on to talk about modern Zimbabwe and how they kind of dropped the ball, and also bringing up Ukraine, because again, Ukraine is topical for where we are today in the world. And I wanted to close this discussion by asking you about, like, what are some of the critical medications that should be in an emergency medical supply crate or first aid kit being sent to Ukraine to be used by civilians? Because we talked about, in Ukraine, there are some parts of the country, there's no access to clean water or difficult access to clean water. There's also lack of access to fresh foods like fresh meat and fresh vegetables and fruits. There's also a lack of access to sanitation. You're right. So when you're going to be eating that food, can it be done in a sanitary environment? There are all issues going on in Ukraine right now in all of those categories. There have been reports of dysentery, cholera, food poisoning, things like that going on because of the destroyed infrastructure and the lack of healthcare resource. So, Dr. Dodge, what are some of the common medications and medical supplies that should be in every civilian shelter in Ukraine right now? For example, can you tell us about common antibiotics that can be used for food poisoning, or painkillers to be used to have people feel comfortable as they're recovering from injuries, falls, bruises, scrapes, and cuts? Tell us a little bit about your recommendations. What should be in every medical supply kit in a shelter?
Well, before I get into that, one thing is prevention is better than treatment always. If you can prevent the problem in the first place, you're way ahead of the game. But recognizing the realities of war, you can't always do that. So you do need to have some treatment supplies. I think an antibiotic like doxycycline, which is a broad spectrum, similar to tetracycline, but a little more broad spectrum, is a good antibiotic to have on hand. And for diarrhea, that's a tough issue. If it's due to infection, there's a variety of antibiotics that have been used, and they all have their pros and cons. I think doxycycline is just the best all around antibiotic. You need to have alcohol, and they have they're called betadine swabs, which are to disinfect. You can use betadine swabs on skin injuries and so forth. Betadine is helpful to clean up infection areas and allow them to heal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think betadine, alcohol swabs, doxycycline.
Just a quick question for you, Dr. Dodge. You mentioned doxycycline, a recognized antibiotic. Would azithromycin also be appropriate, or would that be too? Azithromycin, Zithromax.
Azithromycin. Yeah, that's a little more expensive antibiotic. That's and it's a good antibiotic, but it's a 5-day antibiotic. It's more likely to cause some side effects than the doxycycline is. I think doxycycline is a better all around one to use.
Right.
Azithromycin is a possibility, though. Yes.
Okay. And you also mentioned the swabs. Sorry, what was the name of those swabs again? Betadine, betadine, betadine. Betadine swabs, and of course, alcohol, clean instruments to use with patients, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Well, anything else that would come to mind that should be in a shelter's medical supply cabinet? So we covered antibiotics. We've covered disinfectants. I know a lot of these cabinets already have iodine in it.
Yeah, some iodine to sterilize the water. That has to be used very, according to directions, very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good thing to add. Yes.
Great. Okay.
And then plenty of I said rolls of bandages.
Right. Well, sure. Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of the injuries I would imagine would be people being hit by falling rubble, from destroyed buildings, things like that, and
exactly.
Burns, yeah, basic burns from munitions, things like that. But food poisoning, and not having access to clean water. I think that, in my opinion, looking at the information we have now, that has a huge potential to be one of the biggest problems for the health of the civilian population right now. Not necessarily bombs and bullets, but waterborne diseases and lack of sanitation.
Lack of sanitation, lack of adequate water. Period. That's huge.
Yeah.
And no kit can make up for lack of having enough water.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So at some point there needs to be restored access to facilities and infrastructure, because I guess what we're talking about now is just a stopgap measure at the end. Yeah.
There's a saying that Dr. Beth Freites from Harvard University. She's president of president-elect for the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Lifestyle medicine teaches how to live in a healthy way, so that you need less medical treatment. And one of her favorite sayings is, "Physicians treat, nature heals."
Okay. And could you repeat that one more time for our audience? Physicians
treat, nature heals.
Nature heals, right. So
Hippocrates said it Hippocrates said the father of medicine 5,000 years ago. Said, "Let your food be your medicine, let your medicine be your food."
Okay.
So, and for many, many years, even in 50 years ago, nutrition was downplayed as an important healing source. It was thought that the pharmaceuticals were much more important than nutrition. And so nutrition was not taught well in medical schools. It's only beginning to be taught well now in the last 10 years. Some of the medical schools in the forefront are starting to teach good nutrition. Nutrition is so important, much more important than many, many people realize. And I'll give you a quick personal example of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was diagnosed with bladder cancer in 2018, 3.5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was a superficial cancer. Fortunately, it was not invasive,
mm-hmm.
but it involved a third of the surface of the inside of the bladder mucosa,
mm-hmm.
A third to a half. And so the standard treatment for that is chemotherapy with BCG treatment. But they wait about 12 weeks after the diagnosis because they want to let this inflammation subside. When the diagnosis is made by scraping the inside of the bladder to get the tissue so you can diagnose it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had my diagnosis was a superficial but non-invasive bladder cancer with a high risk of recurrence no matter how you treated it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did some reading about that, and Dr. Walter Lee, L.I., has done research over the last 40 years. He is a physician, a researcher, and a cancer treatment specialist. And he was very interested in what nutrition, various foods would do to various kinds of cancer. And so he experimented by dropping vegetable extracts, various vegetable extracts, on petri dishes of cancer cell growths, different kinds of cancer cells. And what he found was that various different foods would have varying effects on different kinds of cancer. And he found out that foods in the cabbage family, the cruciferous vegetables, stopped bladder cancer growth dead, completely dead. They killed the cancer cells in the petri dishes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I read about that, and I said, well, I said to my urologist, let me try on strong cruciferous vegetables before we go to the BCG treatment. And he said he was skeptical, but he said, "Sure, I have to wait 10 weeks anyway." So he waited, and I ate a lot of cruciferous vegetables: cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, cauliflower, foods in that family, and 10 weeks later, he did he looked into the bladder with the uroscope, and he was stunned. He could not find one trace of cancer in my bladder. Mm-hmm. He said to us, I was under some mild anesthesia, and he said to his surgical assistant, "Do we have the right patient?" And the surgical assistant looked at the papers and said, "Yeah, that's the right patient." Mm-hmm. And he was stunned. It was gone. So he had me get. He does a bladder examination He did it every 3 months for 3 years, mm-hmm. and never has recurred. At first, he said, "It's going to come back." It never has recurred. I am very faithful in my eating a cruciferous diet, mm-hmm. and now at 3.5 years, he's finally convinced. He says, "Well, we'll go to just 6-month examinations now." Mm-hmm. And so, what my point that I'm making is that a nutritional, a therapeutic nutritional diet is more effective than any pharmaceutical treatment could be.
Right. It's a very powerful testimony you shared. So thank you for that. And again, congratulations also about the results of your nutritional treatment.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's important information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanna spend the last 5 minutes of the talk. So moving on from medicine in resource-constrained areas like your time in Africa, and also moving on from what's going on in Ukraine today. And let's talk about Tim's story, okay, your flagship book. And The question I have for you, Dr. Dodge, who is this book for? Tim's story. What should people take away from the book after reading it?
Well, this book is it's a combination. It's a unique combination. It's a combination of an autobiography, a brief autobiography, my autobiography. By the way, I was Tim. I make that clear at about the 10th page. My nickname as a child was Tim.
Okay.
Because my mother's name was Jonas. I don't know why they didn't name me Tim, but that was my nickname as a child. Then when I went to school, they had to change it. They had to start calling me Edward. So I was Tim. And so it's autobiography. It's a health manual. I could provide health insights and recommendations throughout the book. Several chapters dedicated to that. And it's also a spiritual, the importance of a spiritual orientation in life. And by spiritual, I want to make sure that any listeners would understand. I don't mean religious. Religion can teach spiritual values, but by spiritual, I mean values like love, joy, peace, and so forth, that are they're qualities of the spirit that everybody has. Tim's story goes into the fact that we are beings of energy. Our universe is a universal of energy. Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winning physicist of 100 some years ago, said 100 years ago, there is no matter as such. We are bundles of energy, because at a subatomic level, even rocks are mostly space. They're space with the energy tying the little electrons and the nucleus together, and it's the energy that is the source of the matter. And so we are energetic beings, and the qualities of the spirit are very important. If you understand that we are beings of energy, qualities of the spirit like love and peace are so important in making sure that our energy that we express and that we have is a clean energy. So the book is a combination of a autobiography, health manual, and just a spiritual view of health. When you have a spiritual view of health, it's empowering because you realize the materialist says that the body is all there is. The brain, when the brain dies, the consciousness is just a function of the brain. And when the brain dies, that's the end and that's all there is to it. And a spiritual outlook says, no, there's a greater consciousness, and we connect with that greater consciousness. Our minds connect with that greater consciousness. And the consciousness lives on after our death. Our bodies are vehicles for our beings. We are not our bodies. And that is such an important point, because if people understood that our bodies are vehicles, we need to take good care of our vehicles. When you have a car, you want to take good care of it to make sure it lasts as long as it can. But the spirit inside of you is not material. It's spiritual, and it lives on. There's Dr. Raymond Moody has written about near-death experiences, his famous Life After Life book, and then now he's written about 13 best-selling books. Most recently, he's been writing about shared death experiences, and that is where a hospice worker, for instance, working with a patient who's dying in a hospice situation, at the end of life, people often have a vision that brings clarity to them in the last minute or two of life. They may be have dementia, but in the last minute or two of life, they become clear. They see a vision of someone on the other side who is welcoming them. And the shared death experience is when the hospice worker or the health caretaker is aware of that vision on the other side also, is aware of that welcoming presence. Mm-hmm. And so he's got a fascinating set of books on shared death experiences that is powerful. So that brings a whole other dimension into it that I don't really cover in Tim's story, but I wanted to bring it out. It's why a spiritual outlook is so important.
Okay, great. And we're talking before the interview that you also make it very accessible and for the layperson like myself to really absorb these concepts in your book, to make it very easy to take apart and to absorb. And you mentioned that there are several categories of health that all have to be considered, not just one or two. All of them have to be considered. Now, already you stressed how important nutrition is. You shared your own testimony of how powerful nutrition can be as a medicine, as a tool of medicine even. In the book, you also mentioned, from what I recall, you mentioned the importance of exercise, right? And physical activity.
And that's very true. That goes hand in hand with good nutrition. You have to have good exercise. You've got to keep your body moving and working. And so I recommend walking. There's a ton of exercises you can do, all kinds of exercise. Dr. Kenneth Cooper wrote the book Aerobics in around 1970, and it became a worldwide bestseller. And that's what popularized jogging and hiking as good sources of exercise. But his book classifies 50 different kinds of exercise you can do and grades them and their value. The important point is to keep the body moving. If you become a couch potato, you're much more subject to you're much more vulnerable to the Western diseases, all the diseases. We know, just taking the COVID pandemic, that people who were obese, significantly overweight, are far more vulnerable to the infection than people who were vibrant exercisers. So good nutrition, good exercise go hand in hand, and that is hugely important. And then the third element is hygiene, which we covered briefly in talking about Ethiopia. You have to have clean habits, clean living, clean water. That's why water is so important.
Right.
And so, and then the final thing that is element that I stress in the book is the importance of relationships. Relationships with other people is much more important than we realize.
And why is that? And why is that?
Well, Dr. Dean Ornish wrote the book Love and Survival. He wrote that about 30 between 30 and 40 years ago. Dean Ornish is famous in medical circles because he is the first physician who proved that you could reverse coronary artery disease through a healthy lifestyle. Before him, they said the only way you could reverse coronary artery disease was with either a stent, placing a surgical stent, or bypass surgically. Right. And he proved that he has the elements that I talk about: good nutrition, good exercise, graded exercise, good hygiene, and stress, coping with stress. And he went back and then he had group support. He grouped his patients into groups of 10 or 12, 15 people. And to his surprise, when he went back and reviewed his data several years later, the most powerful factor that favorably influenced his patients was the group, the being in a group with others who cared. Because as they met every week, they began to care about each other. And so he wrote Love and Survival. He did a lot of research on this and researched hundreds of other kinds of diseases, and found that it's the groups that share their experiences are they do much better than people who don't. So, and I might just add that the importance of connection is seen through things like Facebook and cell phones. People want to connect with other people. They don't. Connection is very important, and he makes it clear that it's so important to our health, much more important than we realized before that.
Right, makes sense. And leading, talking about relationships and health. The last category that I remember from Tim's story, you also stressed the importance of sex. And I bring that up, and I want to ask you about that in our final part of our conversation about Tim's story. And the reason why is that, every health guide and wellness manual on Amazon and anywhere else, they always talk about nutrition and they always talk about exercise, diet and exercise, diet and exercise. We're hearing that every day, right? But what I found interesting about Tim's story was that this is one of the few books in this genre that takes a holistic view also about relationships and sex. And that is those two categories are often left out of a lot of the mainstream health and wellness books. So can you tell us a little bit about quite frankly, the importance of sex and wellness?
Well, sex is obviously an important aspect of relationships. So you don't have sexual relationships you have sexual relationships with only somebody extremely important to you.
Right.
The point I'm making there is that sex is essential for the survival of our species. It is obviously important for that reason. But it is not the end-all and be-all of life. Sex is valuable within a healthy relationship structure, but there's a lot of dangers involved with sex too, a lot of hazards, and so I bring that out in the book too. The most important safeguard in sex is having a relationship with a person that you consider as a sacred relationship. You don't go wandering off with all kinds of other sexual liaisons. So I talk about that. I talk about the wandering, about what's good about sex and what you want to avoid about wandering sex and things like that.
Okay.
So I discuss it frankly.
Okay. Well, so in order for people to find out more about that category and all the others, which are just as important, I encourage our audience to pick up a copy of Tim's story, which is easily available on Amazon.com. And also, Dr. Dodge here will be offering a limited edition that can be autographed and having a personal message written in there if you'd like. So we've got several editions of the book that are available already and that will be available in the near future. So, pick it up, Tim's story. And Dr. Dodge, for people who want to learn more about yourself and your ideas and your philosophies, and of course, we're learning about all of your other books as well, because Tim's story is not your only title. Could you tell the audience where can people find you online? Do you have a website or a blog, for example?
Yes, I have a website that's called The Power of Lifestyle. If you type in just Power of Lifestyle or The Power of Lifestyle, I'll be the number one site that's brought up, because I've got that as my my signature, I guess, on the internet.
Yeah.
Or if you type in Dr. Ed Dodge, it'll bring you to that also.
Okay. Okay.
So Power of Lifestyle or Dr. Ed Dodge.
Poweroflifestyle.com.
Yes, .com.
Okay.
And that website has dozens of pages and lots of information about my other books and my blogs and the things I've written in the past. So, yes, I thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, folks. So there you have it. This has been a pleasure and an honor to speak with Dr. Ed Dodge of thepoweroflifestyle.com. And again, he is the author of Tim's Story, now available on Amazon.com. And there will be a separate paperback edition available soon that can be hand autographed and signed by the author himself. That will be available shortly as well. So I encourage you to pick up either version as you see fit, or even both. It makes a great gift. And Dr. Dodge is not a very long read, right? I know it's densely packed with a lot of good information, but it's a quick read, right? It's about
yes, it's an easy read. Let me get the book.
Yeah. Let's see it. Let's see it live on camera.
It's less than 100 pages. This is the book.
Okay.
And you can see the figure on the cover. It's trying to, in a visual way, to embody the physical, the spiritual combination involved in health. So yeah, and this is the second edition. I originally wrote the first edition in 2008. And so the second edition is an updated edition and upgraded and brought it right up to date. And so, yes, the second edition is what I would recommend.
Okay, perfect. Okay, folks, there you have it. So, Dr. Dodge, thank you again for joining us, and hope to talk to you again shortly.
Seth, thank you very much. I appreciate your hosting this.